Nefarious takes on a concept that has always been really interesting to me, and that is, what if instead of being a hero in a game, you are actually playing as the villain? This isn't a theme that has been utilized very often in games. Of course, you're mostly playing as a hero. But in the cases where you do have a game where you're playing as a villain, it is more often than not pretty tongue-in-cheek, pretty humorous. It's not very serious. And I get why this concept or this subject matter hasn't been taken to its utmost. It's mostly because telling a dark and villainous story is really hard to do while remaining morally right or morally acceptable or even critically and commercially acceptable. I mean, recently there was that game Hatred that came out in which you pretty much played a psychopath whose only goal was to just kill people. And that game was absolutely slammed, and rightfully so. It was a pretty gross game. But the concept of that game was, what if you're the villain? There's no good in you. All you do is kill. And that's not really interesting. It's just weird, and the outrage was justified about that game. So to put a player in the shoes of a villain and have it not be completely morally screwed up, it has to be silly. You have to be tongue-in-cheek. And that's absolutely what Nefarious does. It is a 2D platformer with pretty standard and familiar mechanics. You play as a villain character named Crow, whose goal is to capture these princesses from different themed lands and harness their quote-unquote princess energy to help him take over the world. One of the most standout things about Nefarious, and arguably what sets it apart, are the fact that each level is designed to mimic a trope or mimic a certain style of gameplay, and that really is shown in the boss battles. Each of these boss battles, where you're actually kind of playing as the boss, has a gimmick to it that makes it really interesting. In one example, it actually turns into a turn-based RPG, which kind of comes out of nowhere, but it's a really welcome surprise. Visually, the game has a very crisp, cartoonish look to it, with some really good animation on some of the characters and enemies. It runs super smooth, and like most platformers, if you get the hang of it, you get into a rhythm, and you kind of glide through each level. Your main attack is a punch, which you have omnidirectional control over, so you can cover all sides from attacking enemies. Your secondary attack is a projectile weapon, which has 3 charges, and they do charge up pretty fast. I never was at a time when I felt like I was in dire straits without it. And as you progress through the game, you'll collect points in each level, which you can use to upgrade both your primary and secondary attacks. Each level follows a similar pattern and can take anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes to complete. These levels are chock full of enemies and tons of platforming, and at the very end, you will have a boss fight. There are some things that I found that I wish were a little bit different about Nefarious. The hitbox around the enemies and your character as well seems kind of inconsistent at times. Most of the deaths I experienced in the game were from poor platforming. I only got killed by enemies, I think, once or twice. And that's mostly due to how many health pickups that the enemies throw back at you once you defeat them. It's at such a high rate that I've never felt really in danger of being killed by enemies. And I just wish there was a little bit more incentive for me to take the side of the villain. I mean, I am playing as him, and I get why he's doing what he's doing, but at the same time, maybe give him a little bit more depth. Nefarious did come out in 2017 for PC, but it is now, as of this week, available on Switch, PS4, and Xbox One. Check it out for a different take on a traditional platformer.